Hey, how's it going? We have a new toy to play with today. This is the MIR-1 37mm f2.8 for M39 mount. So the condition that I received this specific copy of the lens in isn't particularly great. The aperture rings were a little stiff and the focus ring was sticky. It tended to get, it wasn't very smooth to turn. As I was trying to open this up for service to re-lube and clean everything, I couldn't find a definitive guide online as to how to properly disassemble this lens from top to bottom. And I hope this video will serve as a starting point for anyone who in the future would like to fully service their own MIR-1 or any other copy of it. I've already gone through and disassembled this lens once, and I've already cleaned out a lot of the dirty grease in here. So you're not gonna see the full discovery of how I open this lens. I'll walk you through the steps. And there is a little more cleaning for me to do in this lens, especially around the aperture mechanism. So yeah, we'll start by tearing this lens down from top to bottom. For now, I'll go through the tools that we'll need. You will want a working surface that's not your table, because this is gonna get fairly greasy and fairly dirty. My normal working mat is taken up by another project right now, and I'll make another video about that later. So we're going to use printing paper as our work mat. We'll need a couple of these. As for tools, we'll need a lens wrench, and we will also need, I don't know what these are, but like they're rubber conic things that you can sort of get on Amazon or eBay. They're a set of friction-based tools where you can sort of put the lens in and it'll grip the elements of the lens for you. I originally thought I could go without these for most of my disassemblies, but specifically for this MIR-1, you definitely need one of these to get into the mechanisms. Next, you'll need a screwdriver set, and you'll need a 1mm flat head and I believe a 2mm flathead. Yeah, a 2mm flathead. A set of tweezers to pick up small stuff. You don't need this, but it's nice to have. And another nice to have is one of these vacuum suction cups. It's kind of like a syringe with a suction cup attached to the end. You're going to need a lot of cotton swabs and paper towels if you're cleaning off all of the grease on the inside of the lens. And the cleaning fluid I recommend is lighter fluid, because there are plastic elements in this lens and you kind of don't want to wreck it with alcohol. Yeah, okay, let's dive right into it. Okay, so I did go find myself a better working mat, and let's get cracking. The very first thing that you need to do is remove this retention ring from the very back of the lens. You do that by taking your 1mm flathead and removing 2 screws from this mount. There are 4 holes in this retention ring. 2 of them are meant for the lens wrench, and 2 of them are the screw holes. You don't want to mix up these 2 because you don't want to stick the lens wrench down the screw holes. That would be very bad news. And there, this retention ring is now loose. I've already taken this apart once, so it's not too much trouble for me to get it off. The very first time it was very stiff. And we'll just put that aside. Once that's off, once that's off, the focusing block should pop off from the optical block. And this is the entire focusing mechanism where the helicoid reside. And here you can see the close focus stop and the infinity focus stop. The next thing we need to do is, again, you take your 1mm flathead and remove 3 screws from the side of the focusing ring at 120-degree angles to each other. One trick I learned from my very first disassembly is that you can unscrew these by about 3 or 4 turns, and you can leave the screws inside the focusing ring. That way you don't lose the screws. But okay, there you go. Once you have all the screws sufficiently loose, the focusing ring should pop out backwards from the rest of the focusing block. This is the camera mount, and this is the focusing ring. The next thing would be to remove this outer black ring. This outer black ring has 4 holes, 3 of which are the sockets for the focusing ring screws that we just removed. And one of them, this one here, has a single locking screw in it. And this is where these rubber grommets come in. You'll take the largest rubber grommet and secure it over this black ring, because this ring goes on very tight, as this ring is what sets the, what secures the camera mount to the rest of the body. And you want to turn it, you want to turn this ring to the right, clockwise. There you go. Yeah, this is where these really came in handy. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get this ring off. And I will put this screw back into this ring very temporarily, just so that I don't lose it. And now that we're here, our next, so once that black retention ring comes off, the camera mount, the actual mounting thread for the lens will pop right off. And this is where you're gonna start encountering a lot of grease. When I first took this out, this entire region was full of grease. After that, you can switch to your 2mm flathead and start undoing these positioning pins. 3 of them in total. So right now, this is where it gets a little more tricky once you start putting it back together. Right now, where I had these locking pins, the focus coil, the focus helix, was pushed up against the infinity stop. This is the infinity stop. And this hole right here is the locking pin that pushed up against the infinity stop. You need to remember roughly how high this hole is up above this surface here, because this will be important later on. You need about a 0.5 mm or 1 mm precision, because later when it comes down to reassembling this helix, you'll need to put the helix in at this exact height and reassemble all of the locking pins. Otherwise, you won't be able to achieve any sort of relevant focus with the lens. Once that's out, I believe this entire thing should just pop out. One thing that's kind of useful to help you figure out where to reset this lens is as this came out, so this is where the helix popped off from the rest of the body. This pin can serve as a guide for roughly how to align your helix on this ring. So I've remembered that this pin here is supposed to align on the left side of this white mark on my main body. So when I go and put it back, I can align this pin here, turn it I can turn it clockwise a little bit. Oh, hang on. I can turn it clockwise just a little bit, and then I can start screwing it in. And this will make sure that I'm actually aligned, because there's two sets of helixes in this thread, not just a single one. And when you first open this, you'll have a lot of grease covering this helix. I think most likely it'll be gray. So you can start cleaning this off with lighter fluid and paper towel. Really use your fingernails to get in there to get all the dirty grease off. Onto the optical block. So what we'll do is we'll disassemble the outside of the optical block first. So that'll be the aperture, rings, and mechanism. And we'll take out the lenses at the very end. To get this started, this large aperture ring, the smooth one, is held in place with three screws at 120 degrees to each other. Same thing as the focus ring. So we'll need our 1 millimeter flathead. Okay. And with that, it should pop off backwards. And this is the smooth focusing ring. Not too much to it. And following that, you should be able to remove the ring that actually controls aperture. So if I turn this ring here, I don't know if you guys can see, but the aperture turns inside the lens. So this is the ring that actually controls the aperture. This one can come off. The tricky part about this is you have to remember roughly how much gap is in between this ring and the next ring. Otherwise, your aperture will lock up as you try to turn the lens. So not too much precision is needed here. You can always go back and adjust it. This is important, I just realized. This is the spacer between the focusing block and the optical block. This is what sets the flange distance. This is what sets the optical flange distance for your camera. And since this is a M39 mount lens, this spacer actually is too thick for M42 cameras or any sort of M42 adapter. So in theory, in order to achieve perfect infinity focus, you'll need to sand the spacer down by 0.3 millimeters when you're adapting it onto any sort of M42 mount. But we're not doing that today. I will try to figure out another option for that. So what you want to do for this next ring is, you take your 2 millimeter flathead and find on one side of this barrel, you'll find a pin. This pin is what connects the outer ring to the actual aperture mechanism on the inside of the barrel. This screw pin comes out fairly straightforward. And this is where a tweezer comes in handy because this thing won't come out. There you go. Yeah, this is still a little bit greasy, so I need to clean that again. And if you turn onto one side of the aperture ring, there is a sort of black grayish piece of metal with 2 screws in it. This is the clicking mechanism for the clicking aperture ring. The next one we'll remove. But this clicking mechanism essentially acts as a soft lock for the smooth aperture ring. So this needs to come out before the smooth aperture ring can be fully unscrewed. Again, it's just held in by 2 screws that you can unscrew with the 2mm flathead. And as these come off, the black plate, the spring, it comes off as well. And what will come with it, well, what might come with it is the Magnus, is the steel pin, the actual clicker. Usually this is a ball bearing with a coil spring underneath, but in this specific case, it's a pin with a leaf spring. This is the leaf spring. And now that this mechanism is disconnected from the rest of the body, it sort of just unscrews from the main barrel. Next, we have the clicking mechanism, or the clicking aperture ring. You can hear how it no longer clicks because we've already removed the clicker. The outer ring, again, is set by three 1.6mm by 3mm screws. I happen to have broken one of them, so it's a little painful for me to try to remove and install these right now. And this one slides forward in the barrel. This ring that the outer ring is attached to has hard stops based on this screw that screws onto the inner ring. And we can remove that screw and the outer black ring should screw off. I completely forgot. So this is where the black screw came from, the hard stop. And to my left, your right, there is another small screw in here that you can take out with the 1mm screwdriver bit. And you can loosen that a little bit, and this entire assembly should start unscrewing itself. Well, not itself, but you can unscrew this inner ring from the main barrel, and these two should come off as a pair. So this is the outer assembly for the clicking aperture, this is the inner assembly for the clicking aperture. And once that's off, the exterior ring, the silver ring, comes off as well. And finally, I don't have to take this part off, but I'll show you guys anyways. There's this one final ring that's held in place with a single screw. I believe this is also M1.6. But do you remember that this ring doesn't actually screw all the way down to the end of the thread. It sort of floats there in limbo and is only secured by this one screw. And that's pretty much it. What we're left with is the entirety of the optical block. The very first thing you'll want to do is to remove the front element. I'm going to lay some microfiber cloth down, so I'll have somewhere to put the lenses. you want to take your lens unscrewing thing. I still don't know what these are called. Rubber cones, I guess? Take your rubber cone, I think it's the largest side on the small side. And put it, match it to the retention ring where you see the words printed. And you can place it on the ring, give it a little bit of pressure and start unscrewing it in the counterclockwise direction. And you should feel it move fairly easily, not too much pressure. Click, there you go. It should come off. And I'm going to lift that off with socket. And that's the front element of this lens. If you ever want to do a globular lens modification, I've seen those floating around a little bit. This is the element that you when you reinstall, you put in backwards onto the lens. And there's a fairly cavernous space in between the front element and the next lens element. This is where things get a little tricky. So the first thing you actually want to do is on the outside of this barrel, above this slot where the aperture mechanism attaches, there's a single screw. This is a very small screw. I believe it's an M1.2 screw, or it could be a non-standard size. I haven't found the actual size for this yet. But this screw essentially holds, this screw sets the height or the depth relative to the lens assembly of the aperture mechanism. So this screw is extremely important. But for the time being, we'll need to remove this screw so that the inner optical assembly can come out. Again, do not lose this screw. It's a very small screw and you'll have a very bad time if you lose it. After that, you'll need your lens wrench. I know we haven't used this much, but you'll need your lens wrench now. We'll start at the back end of the assembly. You'll need your lens wrench, use the pointy side. There's basically a pair of rings. There's an outer thin ring and an inner fatter ring that both take flat lens wrench, I guess, sockets. The one that you want to interact with is actually the outer thin one. The inner one is glued onto the lens element itself. It doesn't actually do anything. So you can take, what I find fairly useful is you use the sharp end of your lens wrench instead of the flat end and match it to the width of the outer ring like that. And then you can sort of set these in place. I'm gonna reset the camera and I'll be right back. Okay, where were we? Right, the back here. So you can take your lens wrench once you've set the correct distance. Be very careful not to poke the rear element with your sharp little tool. And you can start unscrewing this outer ring. Clean a bit of dust off this, but if you're lucky, you can use this plunger thing to sort of take out, oh, nice, to take out the rear element and maybe the next one as well. Yeah, don't think we're having such luck. The rear element is easier to come out. If it doesn't, it'll come out in the next step anyways. For me, all of this entire assembly was friction fit, so it was fairly difficult to get any of them to budge. So that one, the next lens element we'll leave for now. and we'll move to the cavern in the front of the lens element, or the lens barrel. So this one, you'll want to use the flat end. Actually, I guess you could use the sharp end for this as well. There's a retention ring. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little dark, but there's a retention ring on the inside of at the very end of this cavern, and they take slotted ends of the lens wrench, but I'm pretty sure you can use the sharp end too. And make sure that when you work down here, you are setting the lens wrench to be as wide as possible, because you are working fairly close to a lens element. And once it clicks, you can pick it out. And there's two elements on this side of the aperture as well. Let's see if we can get one of them out. Oh, okay, nice. I'm doing better than I was last time. What about the second one? Will you budge? Oh, come on, please, please, please. Oh, please. Yes. Okay, and now you've exposed the inner element. And you do want to keep track of which one's which, the lens elements. Okay, and I guess in my case, the aperture sort of just slides right out. That's kind of cool. If it pops out on you, don't worry. If you take a look at the aperture assembly, there is a slot, well actually two slots on it. The slots point towards the front of the lens, and you can see that in one of the slots, this is the hole that we took this retaining pin out of earlier on. I'll turn it upside down like that, and let's see if we can get this lens up. Ooh, yeah, that's what I was afraid of. That's how I got this entire assembly out last time. So if it's really hard stuck inside the lens barrel, these 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order, what you can do is actually release all of the rings and push from the back of the barrel to the front. There's nothing stopping, there's no hard stop going from the back to the front of the lens. It's just you got to be careful with how much force you use. Okay, let's see. So now, oh wait, yeah, no, we're done. I guess I'll show you how to disassemble this one as well. This is the aperture assembly, but I'm not gonna take this entire thing apart. What I do need to do is actually clean in between the inner ring, the inner control ring, and the outer housing of this aperture assembly, because me opening and closing this aperture right now is very sticky, and I do want to fix that. If you notice that at the front there is a slot where we took the retaining pin out of, and in the very back there is another screw that you can remove with the 2mm slotted screwdriver. Once that screw is out, the inner ring should pop right out. Okay, and that's out. And I'm going to open the aperture blades all the way up so I can have a reference position to work from. And there you go. That's the inner actuator for the aperture ring. And I'm going to leave the aperture ring as is. Since there's no oil on them, I don't need to clean them. So yeah, let's move on to cleaning then. If you're going to clean your lens, let's go through all the parts that you want to clean. So as I described earlier, the very first things you want to clean is the helix mechanism for the focusing. That's essentially the most important part. There's going to be a lot of green grease in here. You can use paper towels and lighter fluid to really dig into the crevice in the helix itself, and this should clean up fairly easily. The next space you will want to clean is, again, in the focusing mechanism, between this retaining ring and here's the actual mount of the body. This little flange here sits inside the retaining ring, and there ends up being quite a bit of grease between these two, as well as this flange and the exterior part of the focusing helicoid. Then after that, a lot of grease is going to be inside the clicking part of the aperture mechanism. So between these two rings here. The clicky part of the aperture where it has aperture labels, and the two rings that sit below here, there's going to be quite a bit of dead grease in there. I believe it's lubrication for the actual clicking mechanism and the spring, because there's a lot of pressure and friction. And then there's going to be a little bit of grease left over on the outside of this main barrel here throughout these threads. This is the area of the lens that I wasn't able to clean very well the first time around, because I didn't have anything fine enough to dig into the lens barrel. But this time, I have a friend. It's just a toothbrush. That's an old toothbrush that I'm retiring, and this will help me get into the tiny little crevices in the thread here. And I'll be using this toothbrush to clean the inside thread of the clickless aperture area part, as well as the clicked aperture. Basically anything that screws onto this mechanism and this mechanism as well. So that's what I'll be cleaning. Ideally, if everything worked out fine, there's no grease on the inside or none of the lens elements. You sort of just have to clean them for dust and a little bit of finger grease. And then the aperture itself, you could potentially look at cleaning these areas a little bit. I'll be cleaning between the actuation ring and the housing for the aperture, but nothing else. Ooh, okay, I don't want that. I don't want to disturb the aperture blades here because I know I'm not gonna have the patience to put them back into place properly later. Make sure you do it in a well-ventilated space. Actually, I'm gonna go open a window right now because lighter fluid smells absolutely disgusting. Yeah, okay, let's get started. There are a couple things I wanted to touch on for cleaning. The choice of cleaning fluid is mostly up to you. It depends on how comfortable you are using alcohol to clean around old paint and plastic elements. But I'm fairly wary of using alcohol to clean around old paint, as alcohol can dissolve some old paint and may strip some of the paint off. Also, common wisdom for camera maintenance suggests that you shouldn't use canned air to clean dust off of lenses or cameras. But in this case, I'm not using the canned air to spray down the lenses, just the barrel itself. So I'm not too worried about debris being blown around. And one benefit of canned air is that it guarantees that the air you blow onto the lens is dust-free, whereas hand pumps or air blowers will be sucking in dust from the room and blowing it onto the lens. For the most part, if you're doing a thorough service, just make sure you're taking away as much grease as possible. Any grease you leave behind will actually trap lint from the cotton swabs and the paper towels you use, so be thorough. Okay, cool. And that's all of the grease cleaning. I'm gonna go wash my hands and get rid of the excess lighter fluid. Okay, now comes the task of reassembling everything. One thing that you'll sort of notice is that since we've been using cotton and paper towels to clean everything, there's a lot of dust left over on the fine mechanisms, like basically like cotton lint and paper dust. I actually don't have a very good way of getting rid of it, so I'm going to be using canned air. Okay. I really didn't want to do this part. To assemble this, basically you'll want a very good bit of patience. Okay, well, that took forever. Yeah, it really just takes a lot of patience, nothing else. There is no real trick to it. I mean, yeah, so what you want to do is assemble everything on the inner ring, the actuation ring, and then try to coax the opposite side into the housing itself. We'll start by putting this one small screw, the locking screw, in the back of the aperture assembly. And you do want to put a little bit of tension on this one because you do not want this screw coming loose inside your lens. And once that's in place, the aperture should be fairly secure. Okay, cool. And we have to start by putting the aperture assembly into the original housing of the lens. You'll find that the open slot on the aperture where there's still a hole has to go into this slit inside the housing. And remember that tiny screw on top? That fits into this little dimple on the aperture. Assembly. This is the tiny screw we're talking about. So I'll drop in the aperture assembly this way through the front of the lens. And it'll take a little bit of coaxing to get down there because it is a friction fit. You can look through the back to see if it's actually seated in place, and then you just have to sort of knock it down into place with the tip of the tweezer on the outer assembly of the, oh, there it goes. Sort of just have to nudge it into place. And once you have it roughly aligned, you can reach in here through the slot to turn it to roughly center, and with it in its lowest spot, in as basically right up against the backstop on the back side of the lens, you want to turn it until you can see the little dimple through this screw hole. And once you can see that little dimple, that's your cue to swap to a 1mm screwdriver, and you can go ahead and try to screw that in. This screw is an absolute nightmare to work with, by the way. And you want this thread screw fairly tight as well. It should be, there is a ring sitting on top of this, so it should be pretty much flush with the rest of the casing. From here on out, we'll assemble the outside of the lens, and we'll save the optics for the very last. Okay, so the very first thing is this two-stepped ring with a single screw in it. This goes small ring facing towards the back of the lens. This goes onto the lens first, and it gets screwed in like this. And you'll remember that there should be a dimple where the screw sits in, and this ring does not screw all the way down to the bottom of the thread. Just until where it meets that dimple. For the time being, whenever you do something like this, you can remove the screw that you're looking to anchor into a dimple, and you should be able to find that dimple through the hole that you are screwing into. Doesn't need to be that much tension on the screw, just enough to hold this ring in place stiff. The next item that's to go on is the clicking aperture ring, the first aperture ring. Then The next piece that needs to fit together is actually these two. These two needs to go together in as a whole. These two are what makes the aperture click. You'll need to line these up in such a way that once the hard stop screw in this hole is inserted, these two rings will stop here and here, which should correspond to this slot lining up with the farthest dimples on the inner ring. With that, this ring will actually need to be greased because there's quite a bit of pressure due to the clicking mechanism. And for that, I have bought for lubrication here, I have bought lithium grease. And you can get these at any hobby shop. And they should be perfectly fine for what we're trying to do here. Any normal lithium grease. Ideally, you want lithium grease that's designed to be non-volatile, so it doesn't evaporate and end up hazing up your lens after a while. But I'm perfectly comfortable servicing my lenses, so I will not necessarily be too concerned with that. So I'm going to take a small applicator brush and basically just brush down this entire interface with grease. Make sure you wipe up any excess that's not meant to go on the other surfaces. And that to me feels smooth. Perfect. So now we can take this entire assembly and screw it onto the lens barrel. Again, remember to have the exterior ring, the aluminum ring on first. And basically, if you recall, this inner ring has a slotted screw, and this screw will match that dimple right there on this lip. And you can sort of, you'll be able to find it pretty easily. You can look through the top to find that dimple. Once you line it up with the dimple and the ring is fully screwed in, you can just screw this set screw into place with a bit of tension. You can now rotate this large slot to where the empty hole on the inner ring is and find your locking screw. And then, once that's in place, the next ring can go on. This is the smooth aperture control ring. But before we twist it into place, I do want to grease the inside of this because this is also a fairly often used surface since you have to change the aperture. Most of the grease here can go on the thread itself, but to make sure you don't overdo it because this thread is fairly tight. There's very little space you need to fill with grease, and any leftover grease that you leave here will get spilled onto through the aperture control pin onto the apertures itself. This is where I believe a lot of oily apertures might come from in the long term. Okay, once you have this nice and greased up, you can screw the ring onto the lens barrel. And it should feel fairly smooth with not too much tension. It should feel like you're turning a aperture ring. And remember, don't overturn this because if you overturn this, it will actually bottom out. What you want to do is you want to turn the clicking aperture ring all the way to all the way in the clockwise direction on your right hand side so that it sits against the hard stop here. And once you have done that, at this point, we'll need to install the actual clicking pin and the leaf spring. And before we install the clicking pin, so the arrangement goes pin, 2 screws, and this entire slot where the hard stop is sitting on as close to the pin as possible here. So once you have the pin in place, you'll want to put a generous amount of grease onto the pin. And you also want to grease the underside of this claw, this little curb on the leaf spring as well, fairly generously. Okay, now you can put your leaf spring. There's a tiny little finger on the leaf spring that goes on the top of the aperture pin, the clicking pin. Once that's in place, you'll need to use your thumb or something to press down on the spring a little bit to get it to line up with the screw holes. And once that lines up, you can put these 2 screws in. I would recommend putting in the screw that's closer to the clicking pin first, as it helps compress the leaf spring and line up the second screw. Once the second screw is in nice and tight, you can actually, what I like to do is loosen the first screw a little bit, just to ease a tiny bit of tension off of the leaf spring so that the clicks are a little softer. I don't like super hard clicks in my lens. And once you're done that, you can clean a bit of the grease off, or at least I will. I'll clean a little bit of the grease, excess grease from the aperture pin there. At this point, you can sort of test out your 2 aperture rings, and they should feel like smooth aperture rings. The top one is the smooth one, and the lower one is the clicking one. And yep, that's perfect. Now, if you've done everything right, if you've done everything right, you can open up, you can turn the clicking aperture ring all the way until it's locked out on one side. And if you turn the smooth ring so that it hits the clicking pin, on the opposite side, you should see that one of the holes for the smooth, you can see one of the holes for the smooth aperture ring has lined up with the slot that controls the aperture. I'm just gonna remove some of the excess grease here. Okay, and you can turn it around until you find inside this slot, you can see the empty hole where the aperture actuation ring is. And that hole is where this pin goes into. This pin connects the smooth aperture ring to the actual aperture itself. A bit of tension on it. It would have a little bit of play because of the aperture mechanism itself, but otherwise you can check that your smooth aperture ring now properly engages the aperture. Okay, cool. At this point, you can start attaching everything. The first thing would be to attach this this aperture ring, the exterior silver ring, this is the very front ring on your lens. What we need to do now is start out by turning this ring, this clicking aperture ring on the inside, counterclockwise from the backside all the way until it locks out against the hard stop. And you can check that it did lock out, because now there's no way to turn the smooth aperture ring. So this would mean that the lens is fully open set to f2.8, and you align the 2.8 against the red dot, and that's where you're supposed to set this set this ring. And you can see one of the screws has lined up with that hole, with the dimple right there. So what I'm gonna do is take out one screw, only remove one screw so I can make sure that I can see the dimple on the other side. I will go ahead and screw this back in. And if you get it in all the way, you should feel that the outer ring is now locked in with the inner clicking ring. And all of these screws should sit below the surface. If any of them stick out, you know you're not in that dimple quite yet. So I'm filming the conclusion for this video the next day. I had a bit of a technical issue recording the later part of the reassembly, but I went ahead and reassembled the lens anyways, because the remainder of the assembly is pretty well documented on YouTube. I'll include a link to a video by Retro Photo House about how to reassemble the focusing mechanism on this lens. I'll also include 2 links to videos about the modifications you can do to this lens. One is a globular lens modification where you reverse the front element. That one is by, I believe, Matthew Stern. And there's a close focusing trick where the marked minimum focus distance on this lens is 0.7 meters, but really you can get it to focus down to about 0.35, which is a reproduction ratio of about 1:10, which is really good for a vintage wide angle. Where we ended the last segment of the video was I had just installed the knurling part to the clicked aperture ring. The knurling on the smooth part of the aperture ring is assembled the exact same way. There are 3 set screws that are screwed into this knurling ring, as long as you're lining up the screws with the dimples underneath. To address the reassembly of the interior of this lens, we've already gotten to the point in this video where we installed the aperture assembly. What I would recommend for replacing the lenses is that you start at the front of the lens. The front 3 elements should be installed first, because there's a hard stop ring behind the aperture. If you tighten the retaining rings from the front of the lens first, those retaining rings will make sure that the aperture mechanism as well as the subsequent lens elements are all sitting at the correct depth. Whereas if you start installing lens elements from the back of the lens first, once you put in that retaining ring, the retaining ring will actually push the aperture mechanism forward in the lens, and you're not guaranteed a perfect depth. And that's pretty much it. We're done. This isn't the simplest DIY that I could have picked, but this is definitely a step in the right direction for me, as I plan on servicing my own film cameras and all my lenses in the future. But yeah, I hope you try it too. It was definitely a good experience and very reassuring to know that you can do it yourself. And yeah. Thanks for watching.